What's up, family? This your favorite cousin, Rich, and this is episode, I believe, 37. Yes, episode 37 of Rich Talks. And today, we're going to dive into the spirituality of suffering. So yesterday we talked about the problem with happiness, and in that we led parts of it. We talked about suffering. So today we're going to wrap up the spirituality of suffering. Okay, so suffering is inevitable. And remember, this is what I spoke about with the Buddhists, and the Buddhists believe this as well, is that suffering is inevitable. It's a part of life. So instead of us avoiding suffering, since it's something inevitable, is there a way that we could utilize this suffering for the positive? And I would say most definitely. A lot of transformations, a lot of change comes from or is rooted in suffering. Suffering is a lot of times the catalyst to people's change. Someone who may suffer financially may begin to start having new money habits once their suffering has gotten to a point that is unbearable. Someone may start a new fitness regimen or fitness routine once the suffering of their health has become unbearable. So this suffering is more likely, well, this suffering is more so like a blessing than something negative. Because like I said, this suffering that an individual may go through is a lot of times the catalyst. Sadly, that's just the way us humans, well, a lot of us humans are wired, is that we don't seek change or want to change unless we are in a point of suffering. And I think that also plays a part in being human, is that we always seek comfort as a state of homeostasis. Well, we always seek a state of homeostasis, and the state of homeostasis is comfort. And the times that, so because the state of homeostasis is comfort that we seek, the only time that you move out of that is when you start suffering and it becomes unbearable. Other than that, you stay the same. And this is for a lot of people. Some people, they have the ability to be able to just change direction without suffering being a part of it, which is cool, which is a blessing. But some people don't have that ability to automatically, change. Suffering is just a part of life. That's what comes with life. Without the suffering, would you really be able to embrace or appreciate the good times, appreciate the happiness? even appreciate the change that comes about after you've done the suffering, or even appreciate the future change that is coming while you are suffering. Well, while you are actively suffering, changing your state of suffering to a state of one that is not. It's just like when you're in the gym and you're doing a new movement to growing a new body part, or you're doing the same movement but more weight. You're suffering. Your body's undergoing stress, suffering. It's not just a walk in the park or, like you're picking flowers. Your body's undergoing suffrage. But what is the result after you suffer from lifting this weight? The change that comes about from that suffering is an improved body, is a stronger body, is a more resilient body. See, that's the beauty of suffering. That happens in all walks of life. But sadly, the propaganda of the Western world, more so than anyone, has told you that you shouldn't suffer. Has told you that, suffering is something bad. And to me, suffering is a blessing. It's a blessing to be able to recognize suffering. Well, let me take this back. Suffering is only a blessing if you're able to recognize it and act upon it. And that's whether it's consciously or unconsciously. That's the time suffering can be a blessing. Suffering is not a blessing if you don't know how to act upon it or you haven't acted upon it. So someone who's living in that frequency of not being able to move or being stuck while they're suffering and not doing anything to change it, that's the worst position, I would say. That's when suffering is not a blessing. Because at that point, whatever you're suffering from is continuously dragging you down more and more and more. So in that mind state, in that mind frame, no, suffering is not a blessing. That's why I say suffering is only a blessing if it's acted upon. Because once it's acted upon, that's when that change occurs. And then once that change is finished, that's when that transformation has happened. And you become this new person. So we shouldn't run away from suffrage. Once you feel yourself suffering, or you see a change that needs to come about, but you're scared because now you're going to have to suffer, embrace it. There's nothing wrong with being uncomfortable at times. There's nothing wrong with a little suffering. It builds character. A lot of times too, when you suffer and you undergo great suffering, it can lead to an ego death. Because the things that you once thought, the things that you once held in high regard, when you try to utilize them in the suffering, it doesn't work. And you say, well, how does that work? You know, how does that 1 + 1 = 2? How does suffering equate to an ego death? Suffering equates to an ego death because if we look at it like this, take a step back, and we see these people with all these nice cars, nice homes, these letters behind their names, went to these prestigious schools, all this, correct? Okay. We see that. What happens if all this is taken away? In reverse, before it's all taken away. These people with these nice cars, these nice homes, these letters behind their names, went to these prestigious schools, all this yada, 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 right? So there's these people. And let's say the economy flips upside down. And these people only have these items, these trinkets, went to these schools, have all this because of their job. Their place of employment allows them to have these things. Now imagine if they built their sense of who they are based off of what they drive, where they live, who they're married to, where they went to school. You know, they're rooted, their self-esteem is rooted, their ego is rooted into these things. So what happens if something catastrophic or something monumental happens and they're no longer able to keep up with these things? And now they undergo suffering. Some people are so rooted in these things they can't undergo the suffering of not having them. And what happens? They unalive themselves. What happens? They go down this dark, dark road, this dark, dark path, and never turn around, never turn back. They stay stuck. Why? Because they couldn't handle the suffering. They couldn't handle the ego death that was trying to take place. See, once your ego is wrapped in these things, it's going to take, I was going to say divine intervention, but the divine intervention was the suffering. To get you to shed, it's like a snake, how a snake sheds its skin. The divine intervention, which is the suffering that's trying to take place, it's trying to get you to shed your ego, shed that feeling, that being of you that's rooted in these materialistic items and these letters and all this and that. It's trying to get you to shed it, to become your highest self. And sometimes we as in people, get so caught up and tied up into the world, and we think this is it. And we base ourselves off of these things. And when something happens, like a catalyst for change, aka suffering, when it comes about, we can't let it go. So what happens? Instead of the ego death that happens, we die. That's literally what happens. Your soul. You can still be living, you can still be alive, but your soul, now it's gone. Because you've given your soul to quote unquote the highest bidder. You see how that happens? That's nasty work, isn't it? Nasty, nasty work. That because you didn't allow your ego to dissolve and become anew, your soul is now fleeing you. You see, one of them has to happen. That's just the fact of the matter. One of them has to happen. Either your ego has to dissolve or your soul is going to dissolve. And a lot of times, especially in the society that we live in, people's soul leaves before the ego. Sad work, sad business. But that's just the way the society is at times. That we're so scared of the change. You know, we're so scared of the suffering of not having the nicest car. We're so scared of suffering and downsizing our homes. We're so scared of suffering of going to a regular school, not having these letters behind our name, joining these organizations which makes us feel high and mighty. We're so scared of suffering and letting these things go that we ultimately lose our soul. Now, on the other hand, some people who are not afraid to let these things go, when the suffering is calling their phone, when suffering calls, some people pick up. And some people allow the suffering to take place. Some people allow the shedding of the cars, the shedding of the prestigious schools, the shedding of the letters behind their name, the shedding of the houses, and the old mind frames and the old thoughts patterns, and everything that was used to build them up and keep them high and mighty. Some people answer the call. And for these people, what happens? An ego death. They are the snake. They shed their skin. And after they have shedded their skin, they are reborn. They're born again. And now that they're born again, they have a new take, a new outlook on life. That's why you see some people who used to be a doctor or a lawyer or something like that, you know, who might have went to Harvard or some prestigious school or anything like that. You know, you might see somebody who was a doctor or lawyer who attended some prestigious school, and you might see them working at Starbucks, you know? And you wonder, is this person on drugs or something? Why are they working at Starbucks? You know? What happened to them? But this person is happy. This person is smiling. This person is excited. This person is full of life, full of zest. And what happens, I promise you, a lot of times what happens is this person underwent an ego death caused by suffering. And they had an option. And they chose to let go what they believed in. And they thought they were going to lose out. But they actually gained more. They gained more life. They gained more sense of self. And now they're happier than they ever were because they allowed that suffering to what? To rebirth them, to make them, you know, new. It's just like a piece of coal, you know, as they say. A coal that undergoes pressure turns into a diamond. It's the same thing. That pressure is the suffering. If that coal undergoes that suffering, and it can handle that suffering, what happens? It turns into a diamond. Ain't that beautiful? And this is all with what? Suffering. So we shouldn't run away from suffering. We should see it as an opportunity. We should see it as an opportunity for growth. We should see it as an opportunity to be born again. We should see it as an opportunity to have a new take on life. And people who run away from suffering, aka run away from change, these are people who are still infants. When I say infant, I'm not saying, walking around in Pampers. But their brain is in infancy. Because it doesn't want to change, it doesn't want to grow. The brain can't develop like that. The brain needs to undergo change. The brain needs to consistently grow. The brain is like a muscle. In fact, it is a muscle. The neuroplasticity in your brain has to be worked out, just like your biceps, your triceps, your quadriceps. All these muscles in your body, your trapezius muscles, all these muscles in your body have to be worked out in order to grow, correct? So the same thing with your mind. The neuroplasticity in your mind has to be exercised in order to grow. And that growth comes from what? Suffering. And even if it's not suffering as in something that is major or drastic, even the fact of having to sit down and relearn something, or the fact that you have to sit down and unlearn something. Notice what I said. I said relearn and unlearn. The fact that you have to relearn something or unlearn something just attributes what goes in the category. When you have to relearn and unlearn something, this goes into the category of what also? Suffering. Imagine you thinking about something, or you've thought one way your whole life, and you see a glimpse of something that tells you otherwise, and you feel it in your soul, but you run away from it because you don't want to have to undergo the suffering of unlearning something that you've known or you've lived by for so long. That's suffering. You don't want to unlearn what you've learned or what you've been going by. You don't want to undergo that suffering. Therefore, you stay stagnant. Therefore, now you're missing out on blessings and changes that could happen in your life that could elevate you even more to where you're supposed to be. I said, this topic really hits for the people in the West because we've been taught to live in comfort. We've been taught to shun discomfort. We've been taught to shun struggles. We've been taught to shun suffering. But like I said, there's beauty in the suffering. So when you feel that moment that suffering is about to come about, a lot of us do what? We try to resist it as much as possible. We try to deny it as much as possible. Because we feel as if we turn a blind eye, we deny it, we run away from it, that it'll go away. Let me tell you this, it's not going to go away. What's happening now is that the life that you have been living in that comfort will start becoming a false reality. It'll start harming you more than it's helping you. Because your spirit is trying to acclimate to the changes that's really going about. But because you have not done the proper work necessary to undergo and allow the suffering, your body doesn't know how to handle this new thing that's coming about. It's like you're going to the third grade and you're not ready, so you come to class unprepared. How are you going to be able to graduate? How are you going to be able to go to the next grade? How are you going to be able to comprehend if you don't come to class prepared? You're resisting the education. You're resisting learning. You're resisting, the new change that's trying to come about. And it's the same thing with life. Life is ever changing. Life is ever evolving. And what happens is we resist the changes that's trying to come about in order for us to stay comfortable. Everything around us is ready for us to change. New things are coming in that we could grasp onto, new mindsets, new ideologies, new thought patterns, new everything is coming about. But we resist it so much that now we become diseased. We become diseased. See that double entendre? Diseased and diseased. We become diseased because we have refused to surrender to the suffering. It's almost like resisting arrest. You see, when people resist arrest, what happens? The cops get physical. Now imagine you resisting suffering. You resisting the change. And you're the perpetrator. And the suffering is the police. And now y'all fighting 1 and 2. Boom, boom, boom. Imagine this long drawn out battle that's going to go on. And ultimately the suffering is going to win. You might not change, but the suffering is going to win. The suffering will always win. That's life. That's why you should just not resist it. You should surrender. It's just like the police. The police are always going to win when you're in the wrong, or when the police are arresting you or whatever the case may be. The police are always going to win. Doesn't mean the outcome is going to be bad, because they could arrest you and it could have been a false arrest. You get a good lawyer. Now you win the case. Whoop. But in that point of time, when you're under arrest, the police will always win. And it's the same thing when we're talking about suffering. Suffering will always win, whether you know it or not. You're going to go from a stage 4 suffering to a stage 6 suffering, 7, 8, 9, if you refuse it. If you would allow it, it changes your life for the better. A lot of people who refuse suffering don't believe in the universe. Don't believe that the universe is here to prosper you and not harm you. A lot of people don't believe that. A lot of people take fate and destiny and control into their own hands. That's why they think when things like suffering comes about, it's there to harm them. No. Suffering is almost a blessing. Suffering is a blessing. Like I said, sometimes we don't want to see it because you think it's going to be something drastic. But you always have to think, what's on the other end? What's on the other side? if you don't resist and you just allow. So, to wrap it on up, episode 37, the spirituality of suffering. When you feel suffering come about, don't resist. Just allow it. Go with the flow. And watch how your life changes. When the ego death wants to happen, allow it. Don't be tied into the things of the world that you lose your soul. This is episode 37. It's your favorite cousin, Rich. Y'all be safe. Love and blessings.